Greetings to everybody. Today, at different times, from midnight to early morning, we are around to meet. Our topic is coercion, alternatives to coercion. And I think I will leave the floor to Idil to moderate, together with our dear young friends, Ferhat and Sena. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Joshkun. Hello, everyone. So today we're going to just talk about coercion and what that means in the context of psychiatry and what sort of alternatives could be implemented to coercion and involuntary treatments in general. I'm Idil, and I am a last year graduate, just for the people watching. And this past year, in the SEED group, we actually had the chance to talk a lot about human rights and its relevance to psychiatry and the ethics of patient care in psychiatry. And coercion and involuntary treatments are also relevant. It's our relevant discussion globally as well, in the context that are there actually feasible alternatives there are to implement, the human rights implications of coercion, and the patient autonomy implications, as well as the criticisms of coercion, and whether these criticisms, how far these criticisms lead up to any sort of constructive debate, or versus whether they lead to certain anti-psychiatry movements, or etc. So I think it's a very interesting topic to discuss, and I'm just going to start by giving the floor to Dr. Baron, who's joining us from, if I'm not mistaken, California. So thank you so much for joining at such a late hour there. So Dr. Baron, hello, and can you just tell us a bit more about the topic and why do you think this discussion is relevant for us young psychiatrists at this day and age, and also historically?
Sure, and welcome. And I guess it's 11 a.m. I think there's 11-hour time difference in Turkey there. So hopefully you're had a good night's rest and you're giving up some of your Saturday afternoon. So I think it's a really important topic, and maybe I'll just spend a second or a few seconds talking about a bit of the history of this. So as psychiatrists, we're really the only medical specialists who have been given the right to force a patient into treatment. In the US, there's an interesting history that this really is legal. It goes back to something called the Lanterman-Petrie Short, the LPS Act, of which basically all 50 states in the United States, and I think most of the world, have a variation on that. And what it says is that if a patient is potentially a danger to themselves, usually suicidal, a danger to others, or gravely disabled. And gravely disabled really is not just being homeless, but it's being unable to provide food, clothing, and shelter, and to be essentially unsafe. So you can have people who are homeless and aren't gravely disabled. But according to the LPS Act, and the way it is in all 50 states in the US, and I think in most of Europe, if a patient fulfills one of those criteria, then they can be eligible to have involuntary treatment. Now, typically, the first treatment is for a limited period of time. It can be 24 hours, it can be 72 hours, as it is in California. And then literally at the end of that time period, first the judge must say that the patient is going to be held against their will as a result of being a danger to self, a danger to others, or gravely disabled. So there are special judges in the United States that literally determine that. At the end of 72 hours, the patient is reevaluated. Again, a judge comes out to the facility and determines if the patient is able to go, or if the psychiatrist says that the patient needs to stay longer because they continue to be a danger to themselves or a danger to others or gravely disabled. You don't have to be all three. Any one of them will suffice. So what we've seen, unfortunately, is in countries around the world. In fact, there was a paper that came out just today, concerns that the American Psychiatric Association has on Iranian use of detaining individuals in psychiatric hospitals using these criteria. So I think this is a highly relevant topic, not so much from a historical perspective, but to understand that the beginnings of this were really to protect patients and society from themselves. And what we've seen in various states across the world, I'm not talking about states in the US or in Turkey, but in countries where psychiatry has been used to coerce people into treatment who had no psychopathology at all. It was used for political purposes. And this is something that I think is very important, that psychiatrists, both the senior generation, like Professor Boulan and myself, but really more importantly for you to understand the history of this and to always stand up for the rights of the patient, that we're always here for the patient, that coercion was really meant to protect the patient. And now we're seeing, and this is not new. I mean, unfortunately, this has been reported in Russia. It's been reported in China. And again, I'm not here to make political statements in Iran, in other parts of the world. So I think what would be a really a fruitful discussion, and I'd love to hear your perspective as people just getting into your careers as psychiatrists, is what can we do to advocate for the health, safety, and well-being of our patients and not have our specialty be stained by being used to coerce patients, or not patients, but individuals into treatment in psychiatric hospitals, many of which are much worse than the jails. I have colleagues, when I did a study in the Ukraine many years ago, way before this, and we had colleagues in Russia, and many of them would say that the psychiatric hospitals, particularly those that were used to detain patients, were far worse than even the jails. So I think with just that background, well, it would be good to throw it open for questions or comments or your thoughts about this. But I think this is going to unfortunately continue to be a highly relevant topic that we as a global psychiatric community need to be band together to say that we are always out for patients and individuals, and that we will not use the powers that we've been given as psychiatrists to coerce people for political agendas. So let me stop there, and we have a small group, but hopefully a lively group, and let's discuss the topic. Again, just today, studies came out, so it can't be much more relevant.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barron. I definitely agree with like all the points you said, because especially and how relevant it is today, just by like following the news and like what's happening around the world, and not just in the sense of political abuse by governments, but also in public health policy. Right now, like we're seeing news about the New York City planning to admit the unhoused population to psychiatric units. It's like it is very relevant in that sense. I definitely agree. I think first I want to ask like if the participants have any question, because I do have one, but I would like to give the participants a chance to ask before.
Just I can make comment after your question, actually, though. You can ask, and I just want to actually add something, just my own thought.
Then Farhad, just go ahead and ask, because mine maybe have my question may have a long answer.
Okay, just I want to thanks to all of you, because actually when we chose that topic, I don't have any information about it, and then I read some articles and see that actually it's main topic, especially in psychiatry, because in psychiatry clinic in our hospital, I saw a lot of patients that actually they don't want to stay in hospital, or just they want to go home. And actually at that point, I was thinking like which criteria we should to look at, and makes a decision that should we keep patient in that clinic, or should we continue on treatment, or just we can let them go. And then I see that it's actually depending on the patient decision-making capacity, and actually you should reevaluate that decision-making capacity to see that maybe the patient is in psychosis, or maybe manic episode of bipolar disease, and can't really make the right choice, or maybe can be can make danger to others or to self, as Dr. David said. And actually, in Turkey, I see that it's how can I say, that decision is a decision made not appropriately, because I see that it's really like, um, it's like about the fundamental rights of person, like freedom, it's his dignity or integrity, and these topics are so essential and critical for persons, him or herself. And by keeping them in hospital or giving them coercive treatment is really like insulting their self-confidence. And in that point, it's too essential to figure out, does it really right, or does it beneficial or not. Yeah, just my thoughts are like that. I think it's too controversial, because when I read article, I see them, some authorities, actually they're minority authorities, they say that it's non-negotiable to, it's like freedom is the first thing for a person, and if he or she doesn't want treatment or just doesn't want anything like coercion measurements, you let him or her go and just chose their way. But only minority of authorities say like that. A lot of them say that we should set some measurements about that, and because it can be beneficial for patient and for society. And it's just too controversial. You don't know where is the how can I say, you can put border, because it's like not black or white, it's like gray, like that.
Thank you so much, Farhad. Does anyone else want to add anything? Sena?
May I ask a question to Dr. Bülent Coşkun? The arrangements in Turkey, I don't know about them. Are they similar to America about this topic?
Yeah, let me try to answer. Thanks. By the way, thanks everybody to be around. In Turkey, unfortunately, we do not have yet a special mental health law. We used to do the best, as Dr. Veren said, in mind. We had that we are doing the best for the patients, but actually it was for the community or for ourselves, actually. But with the human rights movements, there are some rules about getting the view of the judge, as Dr. David said, in order to keep the patient at the hospital, or the person brought in by the police or the family members, we have to have the judge's decision. In principle, this way. But during the years when I was in practice, maybe about 20, 30 years ago, practically this was not so much used. There were special large hospitals, mental hospitals, and people in need were carried out to those places by the police or by their family members, just to keep the population in a better position. That was the situation. But now it's much, much better. Although we do not have a very specific mental health law, now, because of the people being more aware of what's going on around, and in fact, regarding the personal rights, human rights, and the implementations all around the country is much, much better. as far as I know.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sena, and thank you, Dr. Coşkun. Iram, do you have a question?
Yeah, I have actually some kind of comment or something that I just wanted to add. So first of all, thank you for this presentation and comments and everything. I just wanted to add that, I mean, I have so little practice in psychiatry compared to you, Dr. Byron and Dr. Coşkun and everything, but I have been in the United States recently doing a clinical elective and in psychiatry, and before that I was in my internship year in Turkey, so it was a good opportunity for me to see some kind of differences between the implications between Turkey and US, and so maybe I can make some comments on this. I think. So regarding Sena's question, I think it was quite different, I think, because during my internship year in Turkey, I saw that, for example, when we had a patient with acute psychosis or manic episode in the emergency department, it was like there were security people and nurses and emergency medicine residents and everybody trying to restrict the patient both physically and trying to give them some injections, some sedative injections, everything. And it was like that. It was like the case. It was that. But in the US, I see the procedure that Dr. Byron mentioned. It was like we have to have a notice from the judge in order to give any medication or do anything, and we have to wait on hold like for 72 hours. I mean, I was in the state of Minnesota. I think that it's different between the states, but it's different to me because maybe if I'm wrong, Dr. Coşkun can correct me, but I think in Turkey we are much more like decisive in place of patients, like as doctors or anything, and we give any sedatives and everything in the emergency unit. But in US, you can't do that. So I think this is the difference, and also I just want to add something. I think that I found that strange that in the US it was like you need to have an information from the judge to start a medication and everything. I was like surprised by this because of that, because patients like they weren't accepting medications by just suggested by physicians, but after the judge said that you need to use them, they were like, oh, okay, if judge says I will use and I will stay. So maybe I can ask something about that to Dr. Byron. It seems strange to me because it was like, I mean, obviously the judge is an important person and make the right decisions and everything, but I think that in the mental health care, like the physicians in this healthcare, like they can decide, and I don't know. It seems to me interesting that they listen to judge more than maybe physicians, or I don't know. It was strange. Maybe you can make some comments on this, Dr. Byron. I mean, I was really surprised by seeing that because eventually at the end they use the medication and use the therapy and everything, but after the judge's decision. So maybe in Turkey we are more like we have more responsibility on the physician's shoulder. Like physician is the decisive person and he or she decide everything, and then the patient need to do something. Maybe we do not have the law so much included in our system.
Well, first of all, the judge is a very special judge. This isn't just any judge. And the judge in the US, and I've been involved with this for many years. I've worked in psychiatric emergency rooms back in the East Coast in Philadelphia, just south of New York, and for many years in Los Angeles, the second biggest city in the US. And the judge is looking for documentation that is protecting the patient. It's not about protecting society. It's really about protecting the patient. And what you see is you can't just say, you have to document why someone is a danger, why they're a danger to themselves. Usually others is, they're threatening to kill someone. So what I've seen over the years is patients will oftentimes, they say, well, if the judge says so, it's going to happen anyway. So they're more likely to do it. Remember that the culture of the United States, particularly in California, where I am now, is very much in favor of the individual's rights. Remember, people who came to the United States, back in the 1700s, it was a very independent. And that culture kind of still remains. It's really about the rights of the individual, not necessarily the rights of society. Many other cultures place a far greater emphasis on what's good for society, not just the individual. That's really not the culture in the United States, and really never has been. So that probably gives a bit of a anthropologic background on this. But I think, what's important for this discussion is moving forward. If someone is acutely psychotic, does it necessarily mean that they have to go to the hospital? Maybe not. If someone says they're going to go out and kill someone, well, then maybe it is in their best interest that they get treated rather than being, up for a murder charge, or if they're going to kill themselves. So I think what's important for you is the role of coercion. Let's almost assume that if someone is acutely mentally ill and immediate, and it can't be long-term, it has to be right now, they're a danger to themselves, a danger to others, or gravely disabled, i.e. they would be unsafe out on the streets. Again, not people who are chronically homeless. You can't hospital and shouldn't be hospitalizing them. But maybe let's focus on those where coercion is being used, and that we become pawns in that. And that's the thing I have a greater concern about. Each country, you're right, has their own philosophical approach to this. But what I get concerned about, and I've been very fortunate working with Professor Boulan in studies and countries and colleagues all over the world through the World Psychiatric, is the things that we read about today. What's happening in Iran. Now, again, I'm not there. I read it on the internet. Doesn't mean it's true. We don't really know. But let's assume that there are certain governments or folks who are using the rights that we have to protect our patients to achieve political ends. People who are dissidents, people who aren't approving with it. And I think that's really important. I think we all agree that we take an oath, the Hippocratic Oath, all of us, that we here to first do no harm, but to care for our patients. And the core tenets of medical ethics talk about beneficence and non-maleficence, the respect for the patient. These are the core tenets of bioethics globally, not just in the US. So I think what we need to do is our field, we tend to deal more with these issues than a cardiologist or an internist or a family physician might, because we're the only medical specialty that really has that power. So I'd like to hear your perspective of what you believe is the appropriate role of psychiatry, of our field, in protecting patients, not only from themselves, but also making sure that we're protecting them from potential abuse by a system that might have ulterior motives, not just the safety and well-being of the patient.
I can go right away if no immediate questions or contributions. So, okay. This is something I've been thinking a lot lately, and because when we read about these things, about this, and I researched about it, so the term is like the political abuse of psychiatry, like psychiatry being abused in such ways, like in the examples you mentioned, Dr. Baron, it's as if psychiatrists are portrayed as the main villain, you know, the main oppressors that use their, you know, field in order to control others, versus when you take a more nuanced look, like my take is psychiatrists, they often don't have enough either like built-in capacity throughout their, you know, medical education to identify, you know, these sort of ethical issues, but in a greater, like the greater issues, they don't have enough political power, you know, in their society, in advocacy and decision-making levels to say like, hey, no, this is not something you as a politician, you as an administrator, or you maybe in some corrupt legal systems, this is not something that you can shape for your own benefit or, you know, gain. This is something, you know, medical. This is about the field of psychiatry and mental health, and it's about the patient's well-being. So that's the thing that psychiatry gets a lot of hate, and like psychiatrists gets a lot of hate in that sense. But I think it's not because of, it's more about what we fail to do rather than what we end up doing. It's like our lack of societal power, it's our lack of advocacy effort, it's our lack of human rights advocacy, and just like being out there and being involved in the contemporary issues that our societies face, rather than that sort of cynical view of psychiatrists just acting evil. So for me, it's more about like my solution is, I guess, just being more structurally competent in a sense of like what is happening in our society and like what sort of power we have as psychiatrists and the importance of that power and the responsibility that comes with it. It's not just a medical decision that impacts an individual's life, which is a huge decision on its own, but it's also a precedent to the way that this power could be abused by other entities and other people. So for this, I think very sole reason, for the very nature of the work we do, I think psychiatry is inseparable from the whole, you know, concept of human rights and like the freedoms and dignity of a person. And I have recently joined, a video on Yale Psychiatry's YouTube. They do these like webinar series, and it was actually about involuntary treatment. And it's actually really good. I would share a link in the chat and the comments as well. And there they talked about just having this human rights-based approach implemented in patient care. Like, what are the rights of this person? And I think the point you made was very important. Like, we think involuntary treatment and coercion is something against the patient, but if I was suffering from an acute episode of psychosis or like in any sort of like acute illness that would end up me hurting myself or someone else, and if the medical provider had the power to stop me and like doing this thing that I don't want to do, that thing that will impact my life in a bad way later on, I would want that person to do it, to like help me in that sense. So that's the point of our care, you know, to help act in the benefit of our patient. So I highly recommend everyone to check out that session. I will share it. But thank you so much. Yeah, that has been my 2 cents. I hope I wasn't babbling too much. Yeah.
You raise a very important point, but one I think we need to differentiate. One is our individual responsibilities. Yeah. When we're working in an emergency room, we're in the clinic with that patient. And I think that's quite a bit different than talking about doing this as a societal issue. So my recommendation would be, and what we've done in the United States, and in fact, the director of the psychiatric emergency room at Yale, I was at a meeting with him just a few weeks ago. He's a good friend. He's been for almost 30 years the head of that. So he deals with this a great deal. I think what we need to do is use our organization, whether it's the country, the World Psychiatric in the US, the APA. If you saw it today, the APA came out and made a statement against the Iranian issue. It wasn't individual psychiatry. You know, it's this safety and power of numbers. You know, it could be very dangerous for an individual psychiatrist to come out and go against, you know, a government, particularly one that can be, you know, sometimes fairly ruthless. But where I believe we need to do is band together as a group. Think of it as a group of students. If one student goes up and complains about a bad faculty member, that's not the same as the whole class coming together and say, this is a terrible faculty member. They're not respectful of students. So I think what we need to do is understand we, at an individual level, always try to do what's best for the patient. But when we're talking about issues like this, trying to do it on your own, I don't believe is a wise thing to do. Even if you're not going to be reprimanded for it, it's one small voice. But we bring all these voices together, just like when we advocate for psychiatry. One voice has nowhere near the power of an entire organization saying, this is not right. And politicians and writing articles. So what I would encourage you as the future of our field is to stay engaged, with it, that this is the power, but the importance of raising a collective voice of the psychiatric community. Say, for example, in Turkey, we believe this is wrong. And that as a society, we believe this is wrong. And then you go out, you get on the news, you do whatever you need to do. So I think it's important that we differentiate what we do with that individual sitting in front of us who says, the voices are telling me as soon as I leave here, I need to jump in front of a truck because it's going to drive me directly to heaven. Or saying there's abuses, psychiatry or mental health, we are experts in this. This is our field. We're going to come out and engage in politicians, engage with the media in a thoughtful way, but always looking out for what's in the best interest of our individual patients, but patients and society at large.
Hi, good day, everyone. I'm actually very interested with the points that both of you just brought up, Idil and Mr. Barron. I'm actually curious how we can actually sort of decide when to use some of the coercive methods that we have, because as Idil has mentioned, we realize that there are some cases where we would need to use coercion for the benefit of the patient. But where do we draw that line? Where do we decide, when coercion is necessary for a certain patient and when is it not? Because I'll just share my experience in Malaysia so far, where I've been posted to 3 hospitals for my psychiatric rotation. There is this general guidelines for managing an aggressive patient. I'll use it in inverted commas because that's not always the entire picture. But the use of physical restraints is always a key factor in these guidelines, which I don't always agree for all the patients that come in. So how can we decide, how can we draw that line of when to use certain methods of coercion and where do we say, no, this is unacceptable, this is going against the human rights of our patient?
It's an excellent question. And I can tell you, this is why I think we need very specific guidelines, that they shouldn't be vague. So for example, in the United States, your hospital, if you're in a psych emergency room or a psych hospital, every time restraints are written, that's monitored. That has to be reported. If your hospital has a high rate of that, and your hospital can get closed down. I've seen psych emergency rooms. So I apologize. I can't speak for the situation in Malaysia, even though I spent a lovely 5 weeks there and hope to get back for some grants. And I've spent some time in Turkey, but maybe Professor Coercion could help us with this. But what I do agree with in the United States is they're very specific and they are written to protect the patient. So it's not easy in the United States. Some of you have done electives there to put a patient in restraints. I think that's a good thing. And even the type of restraints, is it 4 limbs? Is it 1 limb? Is it soft restraints, which are quite soft? Is it the hard leather ones? So this is something that people take very seriously. It's been that way for over 40 years now. And I think your question really is really almost dovetails to what we were just talking about. I think we as the professionals need to decide, how do we have very specific criteria? There shouldn't be soft criteria. There should be, and it should be the same criteria for everyone. And again, in the U.S., there's entire divisions that look at this. So So if you're in a country where they don't have that, I would advocate that you say that this is important. It's important for the psychiatrist. It's important for the family. It's important for society, that society doesn't get a bad name for maybe trying to do the right thing, but very specific criteria. And there are in the US, like if you want to put someone in restraints, you have to demonstrate that you've tried at least 2 other methods to help them calm down. And when you put them in restraints, they can only be for 15 minutes and they have to be rechecked. You can't just put them on and then keep them on till the next day. You have to loosen them. They have to be directly visually monitored so that things don't happen. So I think in response to your question, what I really would recommend is countries that don't have those, adopt ones that make sense. You don't have to use the US criteria, but use criteria. But I believe that this should be reviewed by the experts, psychiatrists, by us, experienced, junior at all levels, with input from patient advocacy groups, from politics. It shouldn't just be what we say, but this is where I think we bring in all the stakeholders. And this is what happened in the United States. NAMI that was very much involved in this back in the 60s and 70s, the National Association for the Mentally Ill, the advocacy group for the mentally ill in the US. What I believe is we bring everyone together in a thoughtful way and we think through, and the criteria is what's best and safest for the patient, and have very specific criteria that has to be documented. And if the documentation isn't there, then there have to be consequences. Not for the patient, for the providers. It also makes it easier for us. You don't want to have things be soft, like, well, am I doing the right thing? I mean, I really believe it's in our best interest to know what this are. And if we disagree with the criteria, then we should go to our hospital administrators or to our psychiatric association and say, this criteria is wrong. We need to fix it. But this is where I think the power of working with the organization to making sure we have good leaders, for you being advocates, not only for your patients, but for your profession and yourselves. So these are the 2 hats that we wear. As a clinician, it's an N of 1. But in some of these issues, like we're talking about today, we're really representing our field and our colleagues, and how we're represented as care providers within society.
Here, I want to touch on 2 points. Thanks for all the discussion. I'm going to talk on 2 different topics. One, we have currently in Turkey a serious problem about health staff, including the physicians. There should be actually a coercion related with people acting against health staff. And we are not successful in this, unfortunately.
Well, can you describe that? I'm not familiar with that term.
Well, people come and do harm to physicians, health professionals, just because they think their patient or themselves are not treated in the proper way. Actually, it's not true. Everybody does whatever they can. But unfortunately, due to maybe overall violence increase, this is adapted to health system. There are real problems regarding the health, health delivery. There is the problem of financial problem. There are the unequal service provision. But at the end also there is a very limited time for the physician to spend with the patient. Most of the time it's expected to be about 5 minutes, which is unbelievable. But at the end, what happens? The persons coming to the hospital uneducated and unaware of what's going on, sees the health staff, especially the physician, as the responsible person, and they aggressively behave on them. This is a real problem which we have to save our health staff, as I repeat continuously, including the physicians. And the other topic which I wanted to share, we recently had a congress in Kocaeli where community mental health centers were discussed in detail, their activities, their efficiency, their difficulties. And a colleague interested in all these activities underlined the fact that in order to have some kind of engagement with the long-term patient, they, during the, especially if it's a chronic psychotic disease or bipolar disorder, whatever, during the time when the patient is much better, they sign an agreement between the patient and the physician. They make a decision that if certain criteria are fulfilled, the physician will take the decision for the admission of the patient or some limitations to the activities. If the patient, he or her, she accepts this, because then, as Dr. Baron underlines, it is because of his or her individual rights not to harm himself, herself, or the community. If it is his responsibility, her responsibility, they just give permission to the health system to limit their activities, including admitting to the hospital. This may work, especially for the students, young colleagues, for their future implementations. I just wanted to share these 2 points.
Yeah, that concept's called psychiatric advance directives. It's been around in the US for quite a while. We also, we know advanced directives, like you can say, DNR, I don't want to be resuscitated if I'm not going to live. And the concept has been expanded exactly as Professor Boulan has said, and it's called psychiatric advance directive. It's written, it's like a contract that's literally in the chart. And again, I've seen it. Actually, I've been involved with a bipolar patient who's not manic, who will say, if I get to this point, I'm saying now, I give you permission to give me mood stabilizing medications, or and oftentimes they'll have a family member that that can be what they call a conservator. Which again, these are all legal. These aren't psychiatric. These are legal things. But I think, to Boulan's point, that's why this is so important. This is about helping a patient to take care of themselves. I think that's a very different topic than when we have political dissidents being thrown into psychiatric hospitals for political purposes, having really nothing to do. And I think the question of how do we protect a patient from themselves is important. But I think based on some of the things I worry about are authoritative states coming in and using something that people say, well, this patient, is in a psychiatric hospital, it's not so bad. Many of these psychiatric facilities, and again, I can speak for a couple of the countries, are actually, you're far better, you're far safer, and you're far more comfortable in jail or prison than some of these, quote, psychiatric hospitals. And that to me is true coercion. That's very different than someone who we're trying to provide quality care for to protect themselves.
Thank you, Dr. Joshkun and Dr. Baron. I think I think those two are very important distinction in yet in the sense that I think both scenarios are relevant in the sense that, yes, Dr. Baron, what you are defining is true coercion, but also I think the way that we kind of have these like discussions in our regular patient care, it's also very important that, I mean, you would agree in the sense that we keep that humility and we, you know, act in the patient's best interest. So it's more, for me, like it's more like a spectrum of patient care, of how we like apply these principles. Something about like what you mentioned, Dr. Joshkun, initially, it's actually something that I'm very curious about as well, like the relevance of resource inequalities, like under-resourced healthcare systems, whether it's through understaffing or being overworked or financially under-resourced. I have observed that use of restraints and like alternate, like coercive methods or like involuntary treatments can be more often utilized in this setting, like Ramin also mentioned, compared to maybe more resourced healthcare systems. So I was just wondering, like, if this is something that you notice also in your like global mental health work. Is this something that's a relevant discussion, like this resource inequality and the way that it translates to the use of coercive methods? Is it a issue that the World Psychiatric Association is addressing, or like you and your colleagues discuss frequently?
Well, you're right. It really can be directly affected by the resources. I mean, if you have 2 or 3 psychiatrists for 4 million people, like we saw in Borneo, you know, that's a very challenging situation. Are people adequately trained on how to treat people without putting them into straits? Sometimes if you don't know what to do, you just resort to, well, I'll tie them down because then they won't hurt somebody else or they won't hurt me. So I think you're absolutely right. It definitely ties into the amount of resources that are available, not just money, but professionally trained people who know how to handle this. So there's no question about that. I think that the key issue that you raised, again, is one of the core tenets of bioethics. And one of those core tenets is respect for the patient, respect for the individual. So, you know, it might be disrespectful to not tie them down if they're trying to cut themselves or they're trying to attack others and they're going to get hurt. So but I think you raised another important point, and absolutely the WPA and our president, Afzal Javed, who's been on a number of these calls, Norman Sartorius has a long history of being an advocate for this when he worked for the WHO, and all the work he did for the WPA is that we are very, very concerned about this, because I think it is a bigger issue when you have countries where you don't have enough trained personnel on. They just feel overwhelmed. They're threatened by some of these patients. You know, what do I do? A patient says they're going to go home and kill themselves. What, you know, so I think resources, and if you look at LMICs, it's hard to get to good data, but I think you're absolutely right. It's a treatment that might be easier for the providers, but not necessarily in the best interest of the patient. And this is something WPA really looks for, trying to get, you know, not only equality, but again, more resources so that there are alternatives to take care of a patient other than just tying them down or throwing them into a hospital and no one's even looking at them. So it's absolutely a relevant point, and one that the WPA is very interested in.
Thank you. Dr. Joshkun, would you like to add anything? Thanks. Yeah. We have like 10 minutes left, so I just want to like give like a final chance to ask any more questions. Any like final contributions? I love yous, thank yous.
I'd like to challenge all of you to not let this topic go. It's an uncomfortable topic. It's, you know, it's something that it strikes on ethical, you know, we want to do right for the patient, but then, you know, we hear about this, but sometimes it's the things that are the most uncomfortable are the ones that we need to spend the most time on. I would also say that don't take it on alone. This is one of those things, you know, if you have a difficult patient, you talk to a colleague, you talk to a supervisor. I think this is something, this is really one of the greatest values of being a member of your psychiatric organization, whether it's your student psych club as a medical student, or joining, you know, whether it's WPA or the Turkish Psychiatric Association, because here's where the value of having a collective voice, of having senior members, but getting input from the junior members, because All of you are probably seeing a whole lot more patients in the emergency room. I haven't worked in a psych emergency room in a number of years. So we need to work together collaboratively. We need to listen to you to see, you know what, we've got issues here. We don't even have trained nurses that can help us when these violent patients come in. All they want to do is, you know, fill them with antipsychotics or tie them down. So we need to work together respectfully. The senior people, we need to listen to you. What are the issues going on now? And together we speak as one voice, but always a voice for the well-being and safety of patients and the society that we're charged to take care of.
Very well said, Dr. Baran. Thank you so much. Farhad, you unmuted. It's promising. It seems promising.
Yeah, it's really motivating because it's actually makes I'm in clinic and I see a lot of different patients, and you know, just actually you feel that there's something is missing or maybe not right, because you know, just as Dr. Blunt says, there's no actual law in Turkey. I mean, just regulating about these topics, and actual physicians make decision about that. And maybe you sense that there is something is not right, like related to patient safety and dignity. But you know, it's hard to make a voice or just being voice for them, or just maybe, you know, trying much for I would like to pay attention more, just to make common doctors and maybe just try to understand just, you know, what we can do, or maybe just point about it like that.
Thank you, Farhad. Sana, Iram, Ramin, would you like to add anything?
I want to say thank you for chance of discussing this topic, because this is something I have never thought about, and I will continue to research and think about this topic.
Yay! Iram, Ramin? Yes, no, yes. Iram.
So, I would also like to thank you all for this fruitful discussion. So, and I had some thoughts about this topic, but obviously I will think about it more and more, because it needs to be addressed. So thank you for this discussion.
Thank you for joining. You're the ones who make the discussion happen. Ramin, would you like to add a final contribution?
I'm just glad that we got the opportunity to discuss this topic, because it, based on my my limited experience compared to most of you here, it's something that's been on my mind for quite some time. Whether, you know, some of the coercive methods that we, you know, apply is really necessary and all that. So yeah, I do believe that we can work on some more specific guidelines, as Professor Baran has mentioned. And yeah, I just thanks for the great discussion, everyone.
Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Baran. Like, it's always such a joy and a privilege to have you. Like, from my personal experience, I had been sick this whole week, but like just after this conversation, I feel cured, and like, it's, yeah. So it helped my health, and physical and mental. So hopefully it will help all of us and our patients in future.
Well, that's great. And let me thank you, because it always makes me feel better when I see the generation of psychiatrists coming up and the next leaders saying they're going to think about it, because that's what it really requires. It requires thought. If there were a simple answer, we would have gotten it. It's not a simple answer, but what it does require is us conversing with one another, sharing our thoughts, sharing our concerns, learning from each other, working with politicians. I don't think we want to do this in a vacuum. We need to get feedback from all the stakeholders, but I think we need to be kind of maybe sitting at the head of the table on this topic, because it really affects us. So thank you for giving me Saturday afternoon. It's about time for me. I got to get up in 6 hours to go do a sports event. I do a fair amount of work in sports psychiatry, but it's always a joy to see all of you. I wish you a happy, healthy holiday season with the new year coming up. And I look forward to our next time getting together, and be safe and be well. And Professor Coercion, get well soon, my dear brother.
Thanks a lot.
Have a good afternoon, everybody. Take care. Good seeing you all.
Finally, I would also like to thank everybody for their contributions. Hope to meet in 1 month's time.
January 10th.
Yeah.
Yay. Thank you, Dr. Coercion, for bringing us all together once again. It's all your magic. You know that.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye-bye.